She had not stolen anything. But no one asked. That is the kind of truth that doesn't announce itself. It sits in the corner of a room quiet as a child who has learned that speaking only makes things worse. Della Voss was 13 years old, standing in the doorway of her family's farmhouse on a Tuesday morning in February, and the world she had known for the whole of her short life was closing behind her like water over a stone. People said she was strange. They said she wandered too much, noticed too much, kept too much to herself. They said a girl who didn't talk had something to hide. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that inside the pocket of her wool coat, pressed flat against her ribs, was a folded piece of paper. And on that paper was the only kindness she would be given that day. It would lead her somewhere no one had looked in 30 years. And what she would find there would change the entire shape of her life. Before we continue, if you believe that the truth has a way of surviving even when no one is there to defend it, this story is for you. And if these tales of quiet courage have ever meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories waiting, and we'd love for you to be there when they arrive. The Ozark Hills in February were the color of old pewter. The ridges came in waves from the south and the west, folded one behind the other, like the pages of a book left out in the rain, and between them ran the hollows, deep-shadowed cuts in the earth where the cold collected and the frost held on long after the hilltops had begun to soften. The cedars stood dark along the ridge lines, and the white oaks had gone bare and silver. Everything else was mud and ice and a sky the same flat gray as the inside of an overturned bucket. The Voss farm sat at the upper edge of one of these hollows where the ground leveled briefly before rising again toward the ridge. It was a working farm, or had been once. The house was 2 rooms and a lean-to built from the same limestone that ran through the hills in great slanting shelves. Harlan Voss had chinked the walls himself and put a proper board floor in the main room the year Clem was born. The barn was older than the house and listed a few degrees to the east, but it had never fallen. Harlan was proud of that. He was proud of most of the things he maintained with his hands, even as other things slipped quietly out of reach. Della had lived in that house for all of her 13 years, and for most of those years she had understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that she was not quite what her mother had expected. Nettie Voss was a woman who kept a firm mental inventory of everything she owned and everyone who owed her something. She cataloged disappointments the way some women cataloged recipes, with precision, with care, with the intention of returning to them. Her older son Clem was capable and predictable and kept his eyes down when she spoke. That was what she asked for, and that was what she received. Della was something else. She had her father's habit of going still when she was thinking, that unnerving quality of watchfulness that read as insolence to anyone who wasn't paying attention to what she was actually watching. She kept a small knife on her belt, a gift from the man who had taught her letters and woodworking, old Silas Pym, who'd lived down the hollow and died the previous winter, and she used it to carve small things in the evenings. Birds, mostly. Once a fox with a lifted paw. She left them on window ledges and fence posts and the top of the well cover, not as gifts exactly, but as proof that she had been somewhere, had noticed something, had made something of it. Her mother did not understand the carvings and did not try to. It was the brooch that ended it. Nettie's silver brooch had come from her own mother, passed down from a woman who had come west from Virginia with little more than that one piece of finery and a fierce intention to arrive with her dignity intact. It was oval, smaller than a walnut, with a spray of engraved flowers around the edge. Nettie kept it wrapped in a square of flannel in the top drawer of the tall chest in the bedroom. She wore it only on Sundays and for funerals. It was the one thing in the house that existed outside the register of practical objects, and it was the one thing she would have gone to considerable lengths to protect. On the morning of the 4th of February, she opened the top drawer to put it on for the Sunday service and found the square of flannel empty. The searching that followed was thorough and grim. Harlan moved the tall chest away from the wall and got down on his hands and knees to look beneath it. Clem turned out the wood box and the coat hooks and the small shelf above the wash basin. Nettie herself went through every drawer in the house with her jaw set tight, her lips moving slightly as though she were reciting something to herself, a prayer or a list of grievances or both. Della watched from the doorway between the main room and the lean-to. She had not gone into her parents' bedroom that morning. She had not been in there the day before either, not for any reason she could name. But she was 13, and she had already learned that innocence stated plainly can sound remarkably like guilt to someone who has already made up their mind. Nettie's eyes found her 3 times during the search, and each time they held just a moment too long. The 4th time she stopped looking entirely and simply stood in the middle of the main room with her hands at her sides. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. Nettie Voss did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. "You were in the lean-to yesterday morning when I was milking. You had your coat on already." Della did not say anything. "I asked you where you were going. You didn't answer me." She had been going to the ridge to look at the ice on the creek. She had said so. Nettie had not been listening. But Della looked at her mother's face, the hard certainty of it, the way it had already finished the deliberation and moved on to the verdict, and she understood that whatever she said now would simply become another piece of evidence. The explanations of the innocent are always heard through the filter of suspicion, and the filter changes the sound of everything. She did not speak. Harlan was in the doorway by then, watching. He was a tall man with big hands that had gone rough and dark from 30 years of field work, and his face in that moment was doing something complicated, the muscles working against each other in a way that Della had learned to read. It was the face he made when he knew something was wrong but could not find the way to say it without making everything worse. Clem stood a little behind him, and his eyes were on the floor. There were things Clem knew. Della understood this, though she could not have said exactly how. She had noticed him in the bedroom doorway the evening before, not quite entering. She had noticed the way his face changed when the search began, the way he kept his hands very still at his sides. Clem was not a subtle person. He was built for labor and loyalty, not concealment, and the effort of concealment showed on him like a bruise. But he was 17 and their mother's son in a way that Della never had been, and whatever he knew, he was not going to say it. Not that morning. Maybe not ever. The brooch did not reappear. The search ended. And the verdict that Nettie had arrived at somewhere in the middle of the second search of the bedroom became, over the course of that evening, the verdict of the household. The ejection was not loud and it was not immediate. That was almost worse. It took a day and a half of Nettie going quiet, in the way that meant she had made a decision of Harlan disappearing into the barn, for long stretches of Clem eating without speaking and excusing himself early from the table. A day and a half of Della going about her work, feeding the chickens, hauling water, mending the torn hem of her second dress, with a stillness that she wore like armor. On the morning of the 6th, Nettie told her to take what she could carry. Harlan was not in the room when it happened. Della had thought in some dim and already grieving part of herself that he might be there, that there might be a moment, one moment where he said something that changed the shape of things. But the barn door was latched from the inside, and she could hear him moving around in there doing nothing in particular with great deliberateness, and she understood that this too was a kind of answer. She had her coat, which was wool and heavy enough, and her boots, which had been resoled once and were beginning to separate again at the left toe. She had a canvas bag she used for foraging, and into it she put her second wool shirt, a tin cup, a half-eaten piece of hardtack, and the small knife that had belonged to Silas Pym, the one he'd given her 2 years before he died, with the smooth birch handle and the short, sharp blade. She had been reaching for it on instinct, the way a person reaches for the thing that has never let them down. She was almost to the door when she heard her father's boot on the porch step. He did not open the door all the way. He stood in the gap, one hand on the frame, and he was looking somewhere between her face and the floor, that complicated look again, the one that cost him something. He held out his hand. In it was a piece of paper folded into quarters. His voice was barely above a murmur. "Your Uncle Pemberton's old line camp. Past the second ridge, follow Cutter's Creek north until it bends. There's a gap in the fence line, go through it, and Bear left up the draw. The camp's been empty since he passed, but the walls are sound." He pressed the paper into her hand and closed her fingers around it. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he believed her. He did not say the things that a father might say if the world were arranged more fairly. But he stood there a moment longer than he needed to. His big, rough hand closed over hers. And Della understood, with the part of herself that had been reading the unspoken language of this family for 13 years, that this was the most he could give her, and that giving it had cost him considerably. She nodded once. She put the paper in her coat pocket. She did not look back at the house. The cold hit her as soon as she cleared the yard. February cold in the Ozark Hollows has a quality to it that goes beyond temperature. It is deliberate, thorough, the kind that finds its way through seams and worn thin places and settles in against the bone. Della pulled the coat tight and adjusted the bag on her shoulder and started moving because movement was the only useful response she had. She followed the hollow south for a while until the farm was behind the first fold of ridge, and then she turned to follow the creek the way her father had described. Cutter's Creek ran along the base of the eastern slope, its surface frozen along the edges, but running dark and quick in the center, and she walked beside it with her eyes on the ground, watching for ice patches, for the particular sheen that meant the mud had frozen solid beneath a deceptive surface layer. Silas Pym had taught her to read ground the way some men read weather. He had taught her which grasses grew in saturated soil and which meant rock was near the surface, which bark peeled wet and which stayed dry no matter the rainfall, how to tell a south-facing slope from a north-facing one by the texture of the moss. He had taught her all of this not in formal lessons, but in the way that useful knowledge generally passes sideways, embedded in the work of doing something else, surfacing only when it was needed. She thought about him as she walked. She thought about the afternoon he had given her the knife, set it on the table between them without ceremony, as though it were simply the next logical step. In a sequence they had both understood and said, "The grain runs true if you let it. Push against the wood and you'll get nowhere. Follow the grain and the blade does the work itself." He had been talking about wood carving. She had understood even then that he was also talking about something else. The knife was in her bag. She touched the canvas over it as she walked, feeling the shape of the handle through the fabric. By noon, she had found the gap in the fence line, 2 posts leaning apart. The wire dropped between them into the frozen mud, and she turned up the draw. The slope here was steeper, choked with cedar and scrub oak, and the footing was difficult. She went slowly. The cold was working on her hands, and she paused to tuck them inside her coat for a minute, standing still on the hillside, listening. The woods were not silent the way people who do not know woods believe them to be. There was the low percussion of a woodpecker working somewhere in the ridge timber, the occasional creak of a frozen branch, settling the sound of her own breath, which was beginning to show in small white clouds that disappeared quickly in the thin air. And beneath all of it, running under everything like a current, the sound of the creek, quieter now, farther below, but steady. She climbed. The line camp appeared without announcement, which was perhaps its best quality. One moment she was pushing through a stand of cedar, and then she was at the edge of a small clearing, and the clearing held what she was looking for, but also something entirely different from what she had imagined. Uncle Pemberton's line camp was a ruin. The back wall had given in at some point, pulled down by a fallen hickory that still lay across it, its roots a dark tangle of frozen earth. The roof was half gone. Whatever had been the door was a frame with splinters. She stood in the clearing and looked at it for a long moment, and felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature, but from the moment when the last version of a plan fails. She breathed. Then she looked at the hillside behind the ruined camp, because Silas had taught her that when one thing fails, you turn around and look at what is actually there, not at what should have been there. The hillside behind the camp was limestone, the same gray Ozark stone that built the farmhouses and the church, and the walls along the old road stone that had been pushed up and cracked and eroded over 1,000 years into a series of jutting ledges and deep shadow cuts. And in the face of one of those limestone ledges, perhaps 30 feet above where the camp had stood, there was a darkness that had the particular quality of depth, not shadow. Depth. She climbed toward it, using her hands on the rock where the angle demanded it, testing each ledge before she put her weight on it. The opening resolved itself as she approached, wider than it had appeared from below, tall enough that she would not need to stoop. The stone above it curved in a natural arch worn smooth by centuries of water and frost. The floor inside was hard-packed earth, dry to the touch when she crouched and pressed her palm to it. She stepped through. The space inside was perhaps 10 feet across and 8 feet deep, with a ceiling that rose to a natural crack along the top of the arch. The walls were living stone, not the worked, stacked limestone of the farmhouses, but the original striated face of the hillside running in horizontal bands of gray and tan. Dry. Profoundly, thoroughly dry. The cold outside could not seem to decide how much of itself to commit in here. The temperature was cold, but still, and still cold is survivable in a way that moving cold never quite is. She set her bag down in the center of the floor. The sound of it settling, that small, hollow sound, did something to the silence that felt almost like punctuation. She walked the perimeter. She looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the place where the floor met the stone at the back. She looked up through the crack at the flat gray sky visible in a thin strip above her. Then she crouched at the back of the space where the floor met the deepest part of the wall, and she saw it. A flat piece of limestone different from the bedrock. Deliberately placed. Its edges too clean, too square, its surface worn in the center, the way stone wears when hands have touched it many times. And running along the right side of it, barely visible beneath a crust of dried mud, a gap, a line of shadow where the flat stone did not quite meet the floor. She had spent 2 years learning to notice the things that were different. She cleared the mud with the flat of her knife blade, careful and slow. She pressed her fingertips into the gap and felt the stone shift slightly, a fraction enough. She pulled. It was heavy, and it resisted, and then it gave all at once, and she rocked back on her heels and set it aside on the floor. Beneath it was a cavity, rectangular about the length of her forearm, perhaps a foot deep. And inside it, wrapped in something dark and stiff that might once have been oilcloth, was a bundle tied with a leather lace. She did not reach for it immediately. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. The cold was still present, still in her hands, still in her feet, but it had receded somewhat to the back of her awareness. What occupied the front of her awareness was the particular solemnity of the moment. A thing had been hidden here deliberately by someone for a reason, and she was the one who had found it. She thought of Silas, who had always said that finding something was only the beginning of understanding it. She lifted the bundle out and carried it to the entrance where the light was better. She untied the leather lace. She unfolded the oilcloth, stiff at the folds but intact. Inside was a tin box. Inside the tin box were 3 things. The first was a small cloth pouch drawn shut at the top. She loosened it and poured a few coins into her palm gold. Not the common currency she knew, but older, heavier, smaller, their surfaces worn but unmistakable. She did not know exactly what they were worth. She knew they were worth more than she could calculate at that moment, and she put them carefully back into the pouch and set it aside. The second thing was a knife. Not a small knife like hers, a larger one, a working knife with a handle of dark wood worn smooth along the grip, the blade dark with age but still holding its edge when she tested it lightly with her thumbnail. The handle was stained and cracked but solid, and carved along the bottom edge of it in small, careful letters that she had to tilt toward the light to read were 4 words. "The grain runs true." Della sat very still. She read the words again. Then she looked at the blade in her other hand, Silas Pym's knife, the one he had given her with those same words on his lips, and she felt something move through her that she would not have been able to name precisely. It was not comfort exactly. It was more like recognition. The sensation of arriving somewhere you did not know you had been heading until you were already there. The third thing in the tin box was a small journal. Its cover was leather cracked along the spine, the pages thickened with age, and the faint rippling of past moisture. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was careful and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had taken his time with things. "My name is Nathaniel Doss. I came to this place in the autumn of 1891, and I lived here until the spring of 1893. I came to forget, or perhaps to remember who I was before the world decided it knew better. I have not entirely succeeded at either, but I am still here, which is something. I do not know who will find this, but I have had time to consider that question long. Quiet winters have a way of clearing the mind, and I have come to believe that whoever finds this place will be someone who needed it. The hollow doesn't give itself up to people who are just passing through. I don't know why I believe that. I simply do. I leave the coins because they are mine to give. I leave the knife because it has served me well and deserves to keep serving. The journal I leave because I have discovered that there is comfort in knowing your experience was not unique, that someone sat in this same cold space and felt the same fear and decided anyway to stay. If you are here, you needed somewhere to be. Be here. The stone keeps the wind out better than you'd think." Nathaniel Doss. April 1893. The February light was thinning. She had perhaps 2 hours before it failed entirely. Della closed the journal. She held it in both hands for a moment, looking at nothing. Then she set it with the coin pouch and the larger knife side by side on the stone floor and reached back into her bag for her own knife, Silas Pem's knife, and held them next to each other. Two knives. Two men who had understood the same thing without knowing each other. 30 years and all the territory between them, and somehow the same 4 words. She built her fire that evening with green cedar because it was what she had, and it smoked more than she would have liked, but it caught, and the heat from it reached the rock walls and began slowly to gather and hold. She sat close to it with the journal open in her lap and read until the light was gone. And then she read by firelight, and the words of Nathaniel Doss moved through her in the particular way that words move through a person who has just discovered they are not the first to have needed exactly this. She was not afraid. She was cold, and she was alone, and she had been cast out of the only home she had known for a crime she had not committed. But fear, real fear, the kind that hollows out your chest, that had not come. What had come instead was something quieter, something that felt in the most precise sense she had words for, like beginning. The fire settled. The Ozark hills sat silent outside in the dark. And Della Voss, 13 years old, read the words of a stranger who had lived through a winter in this same stone hollow and had thought to leave a knife with 4 words on its handle because he had believed, despite everything, that the grain runs true. She turned the page, and she kept reading. The first morning she woke before light and lay still for a long moment, listening to the particular quality of silence in a stone space heavier than the silence of a wooden room, more absolute, as though the rock itself were holding its breath. The fire had burned down to a scatter of orange coals. Her breath was visible. The cold had returned while she slept, patient and thorough, settling into the spaces the warmth had briefly held. She sat up and fed the coals with small sticks until they caught, and then she sat with her knees pulled in and thought about what needed doing. This was how Silas had taught her to begin any project, not with the largest problem, but with the first problem. The first problem was the door. The opening in the limestone face let in everything: wind, cold, sound, anything that might be curious about the smell of smoke and the small warmth a fire made in a stone hollow. She needed to close it. Not permanently, she would need to move in and out, but enough. She spent the first 2 days on the door, and it was harder than she had anticipated. Her idea was simple. Cut flexible saplings, weave them into a mat using the method Silas had shown her for making fence panels fit the mat into the opening. In practice, the saplings she found near the base of the ridge were mostly cedar, which does not bend willingly, and her first attempt split at the 3rd weave and collapsed into a tangle of branches that was good for nothing. She sat in the cold and looked at it. She tried again with thinner stock. This held better at the weave points, but the finished panel was too light. The first real gust of wind would move it without effort, and she had already felt what the wind did on this hillside when it came off the ridge with intention. It took until the 3rd day, and a different method entirely, lashing the saplings in parallel and bracing them against a heavier frame she built from 2 forked branches she found in the fallen hickory wreckage of the ruined camp below, before she had something that sat in the opening solidly enough to stay put when she pushed on it. It was not beautiful. It was not even particularly straight. But when she pulled it into place and stood inside with it secured, the difference was immediate. The stone hollow became a room. She stood in it and breathed. Her hands were cut from the lashing work, a shallow gash across 3 fingers of her right hand from where the cedar had split suddenly and the raw edge had caught her skin. She cleaned it with snowmelt and bound it with a strip of cloth from the hem of her second shirt. The cut ached when she flexed her fingers, which was often because the work did not stop, simply because her hand had made its displeasure known. The second problem was fire management. The crack in the ceiling of the hollow, the one she had seen on the first day, drew smoke upward and out with reasonable efficiency when the wind was from the south. When it shifted to the northwest, which it did on the 4th day, with no warning and considerable force, the smoke backed up entirely and filled the hollow with a gray haze that set her coughing and drove her outside to crouch in the cold until it cleared. She needed to understand the wind before she could trust the fire, and understanding the wind meant observing it, and observation took time. She was also spending on everything else. She made a small wind vane from a strip of cloth tied to a cedar branch stuck into a crack in the rock outside the entrance. She checked it often. She learned. The food situation was more urgent than she wanted to acknowledge. The hardtack was gone by the 2nd day. She had found late-season rose hips on a thicket along the slope below the camp ruins, small, bright red, and bitter but edible. And she ate them carefully because eating them too fast produced an unpleasant cramp that she learned about by eating them too fast. She found a handful of black walnuts she believed a squirrel had lost in the leaf litter near the base of the ridge, their hulls gone black and soft, the nuts inside still sound. She broke them open with a rock and ate the small, oily kernels one by one, making them last. She set 2 snares along what she took to be a rabbit trail near the creek at the base of the ridge. For 3 mornings she checked them and found them empty, the trip mechanisms untouched. On the 4th morning she found one sprung, the snare disturbed but no catch. Something had been quick enough or small enough to escape it. She reset the snare with more care, adjusting the height the way she remembered Silas describing it. And on the 5th morning she found a rabbit dead and frozen in the night cold, the snare closed neatly above its back legs. She stood over it for a moment before she picked it up. She had never cleaned an animal alone. She had watched Harlan do it, and she had helped hold things still while he worked, and she had watched Silas once on an autumn afternoon while he talked her through the steps. But the having watched and the doing were 2 different countries, and she spent more time than was efficient in the territory between them. The knife, the larger one, Nathaniel's, which she had switched to for heavier work, was sharp enough to make the work go cleanly once she began, and she got through it without ruining the meat, though she would not have called the result tidy. She cooked the rabbit in her tin cup with water from the creek and a handful of dried grass for flavor that contributed more smell than taste. She ate every part of it that was edible. She thanked it aloud, which she had also learned from Silas, not as ceremony exactly, but as a practice of attention, of not pretending that the living things she took from the world cost her nothing. By the end of the 2nd week, a rough shape had emerged from the disorder of the first days. She rose before full light, tended the fire, checked the snares, returned to the hollow to eat whatever the snares had provided, or to eat nothing if they hadn't. She spent the middle part of the day on the larger projects, sealing the wall gaps where the wind found its way in, improving the lashed door building, the raised sleeping platform she had begun from split cedar rounds and woven branches. She spent the late afternoons reading Nathaniel's journal. It was this reading that kept her most honestly company. He had not been an eloquent man, Nathaniel Doss. His entries were brief and practical for the most part, recording the weather and the condition of his snares and the state of his firewood supply with the same level tone he applied to more significant observations. But between the practical notes at irregular intervals, there were passages of a different kind. Thoughts he had apparently needed to put somewhere. February 14th, 1892. Heavy snow again. I have been thinking about why it is that the people who cast us out are so often so certain of themselves. Certainty seems to require very little. The evidence doesn't matter as much as the need to have an explanation. I was convenient. I expect you were too, whoever you are. Della read that entry 4 times on the evening she found it. She was reading again on the afternoon that Jerome Pickett appeared at the base of the ridge. She heard him before she saw him. Not because he was careless, but because she had been listening to this hillside long enough to know when a sound was out of sequence. The particular quality of a footstep on frozen ground is different from the sound of a branch settling or a bird landing, and what she heard from below was footsteps deliberate and unhurried moving along the base of the limestone face. She went to the entrance of the hollow and looked down. He had stopped about 30 feet below and was looking up at her with the undisturbed expression of a man who has found many things in the woods over the course of a life and has long since ceased to be startled by any of them. He was old, the kind of old that arrives slowly and then seems suddenly complete, and he wore his age in his face and hands without apology. His coat was heavy canvas, stained at the elbows and repaired along one shoulder with a different colored thread. He carried a long rifle across one arm, barrel down, in the unconscious way of a man who had carried a rifle for so long it had become a part of his posture. He looked at the woven door she had pulled aside to look out. He looked at the wind vane she had mounted above the entrance. He looked at the small pile of split cedar rounds she had stacked against the limestone face to keep them off the frozen ground. He did not look at her with surprise. He looked at her work. His name, he said, offering it simply, without the slight ceremony that adults sometimes used when speaking to children as though her being 13 required a particular kind of condescension, was Jerome Pickett. He trapped this ridge every winter, had done so for more years than he intended to count. He'd seen smoke from this face of the hill 3 days running before he'd come to look. He asked no questions about how she had come to be there. He looked at the hollow once more at the door and the woodpile, and what came into his face was not pity and not suspicion, but something she recognized, the look of a person assessing workmanship. He said, "You're losing heat through that door every time the wind shifts. Gap at the top right corner." She had known about the gap. She had not yet found the right material to fill it. He told her what to look for, a particular kind of moss that grew on the north face of the limestone ledges, fibrous and dense, that would pack into a gap and hold its shape when it dried. He described where to find it. He did not offer to go with her, and she did not ask. She found it the next morning exactly where he said it would be. The gap, filled and packed and allowed to dry for 2 days near the fire, stopped moving air entirely. The hollow held its heat for the first time with real consistency, and on the evening that she confirmed it, holding her palm near the sealed corner and feeling nothing, she allowed herself to sit for a moment without working, which was something she had not done since the first night. Jerome came back 10 days later, and then again after that, establishing a pattern that she came to rely upon without having discussed it. He never announced himself in advance, and she never asked when he would return. He would appear at the base of the ridge, she would come to the entrance, and they would talk briefly, practically, about the state of the weather, the performance of her snares, the things she was having trouble with. He told her where to find a particular clay deposit near the upper creek bend that was good for chinking and sealing. He showed her a way to brace the sleeping platform that would keep it from working loose over time. One morning he arrived carrying something wrapped in rough cloth, which he set down on the rock at the base of the ridge without comment and walked on. When she climbed down to look, she found a small cast-iron pot, dented along one side but perfectly sound, and a folded piece of paper with nothing written on it except a small competent sketch of the snare configuration he'd mentioned the week before. She did not know how to thank him for the pot, so she carved a small bird, a wren, quick work, but careful, and left it on the same rock the next morning. It was gone by afternoon. It was through Jerome she understood gradually that the story of the hollow had begun to move outward. She saw no direct evidence of this, no visitors, no curious faces at the base of the ridge. But one morning she came down to check the snare line and found a square of folded oilcloth she had not left there, containing a heel of hard cheese and several strips of dried venison. 3 days later, a bundle of pine boughs, better than anything available on her part of the ridge, was stacked beside the entrance when she woke. She had no explanation for either of these things that did not involve Jerome. She used the cheese and the venison and the pine boughs and said nothing, because gratitude expressed too loudly can make people feel they've done enough. It was during one of Jerome's visits on a Thursday in early March that he told her about Nathaniel Doss. He had been looking at the journal which she had left open on the flat rock near the fire. He did not pick it up, only looked at it from a respectful distance, the way people look at things that belong to someone else. His voice when he spoke was careful in a way that her name had not yet made him careful. Nathaniel Doss lived in these hills a long time ago. His family had land near the county line, or rather the land his family had ran along the county line all the way down to where this ridge meets the bottom hollow. She waited. His brother Everett sold most of it off piece by piece after Nathaniel left. Didn't have the same feeling for it. But the ridge itself, this face here, the limestone, Everett never sold that. Said it wasn't farmable and nobody would want it. He died with it still in his name. His daughter inherited it. Jerome looked at the hollow, at the walls she had sealed and the door she had built. This ground you're standing on, by rights, it still belongs to the Doss family. She looked at him. Nathaniel's niece, Everett's daughter. She's old now, lives in Eminence. Name's Clara Doss. Never married, kept the name. Jerome paused. I knew Everett some years back. I could write to her. Della thought about what it meant to be staying without any knowledge of it on the land that had belonged to the man whose journal she had read every evening for 6 weeks, the man who had sealed her door and packed her snare gap, and written by firelight about why the people who cast us out are so certain of themselves. She had not been sheltering in an abandoned place. She had been sheltering on his land. She felt the particular weight of that, the way a thing feels when it is too large to process all at once and you have to set it aside and come back to it in smaller pieces. Write to her, she said. It was 2 weeks later that Jerome came back with a different quality in his step, still unhurried, still measured, but carrying something. She had almost learned to read him. The difference between his ordinary visits and this one was small, a slight deliberateness, the way a person moves when they are carrying news they have spent time deciding how to deliver. He told her about it without preface because he had learned that she preferred that. The entry in Nathaniel's journal, the one she had marked with a dried cedar strip, was the one she showed him first. March 3rd, 1892. I have been thinking about the silver brooch belonging to a woman in Haskell County who accused me of taking it. I did not take it. I have turned this over many times and I am still certain I did not take it. But I left rather than argue the point because I had discovered something dispiriting. A man who is believed capable of a thing has a very difficult time being believed incapable of it. Once the thought is planted, the evidence arranges itself around it. I do not hold it against her. I hold it against the ease with which one person's certainty can become another person's verdict. Jerome had read this entry when she showed him. He had read it twice, which was not something she had seen him do with anything before. Now he looked at her. "My mother," he said, which was not something she had expected from him, and the unexpectedness of it made her be very still, was accused of taking a watch from a household where she worked. She hadn't. They let her go regardless. She never worked in that county again. He paused. That was 1878. He said nothing else about it. He did not need to. What he was telling her was not simply a story. It was a coordinates, a point on a map. You are here. I have been near here. The distance between us is smaller than you thought. What she understood in the quiet after he spoke was that she had been given something she did not have words for yet. The knowledge that her specific wound was not hers alone, that it had a shape that others had felt, that Nathaniel Doss had felt it, that Jerome's mother had felt it, and that they had all continued anyway. She held the journal carefully and thought about the grain of a thing. The first truly warm day came in late March, without announcement, a morning that arrived with the smell of melt on it, the creak audible from the hollow at a volume it had not had for months, the cedars releasing something like a sigh into air that no longer cut. Della came out to stand at the entrance and feel it on her face. What she had built was visible from here. The door, repaired twice from its original version, hung plumb now and closed snug. The wind vane above it was her third iteration. The woodpile was deep enough to last another week at current use. Along the base of the limestone face she had built a low stone shelf from loose rocks sorted from the slope, and on it she kept things organized in a way that satisfied something in her: the tin cup, the extra lashing cord, the 3 carved figures she had made over the winter and had not yet decided what to do with. It was not the house she had grown up in. It was something she had made herself, which was a different thing entirely. Jerome arrived that afternoon and stood beside her looking at it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You've made it right," which was from Jerome Pickett, a considerable statement. It was the following week that Hattie Crail appeared. Della had heard Hattie mention Jerome had said her name twice, always briefly, always with the particular neutrality that meant he was being careful about how much weight he was giving the information. An older woman. Widow. Lived alone on the opposite ridge. Had not had an easy several years. She arrived on a Tuesday, moving up the slope with a steadiness that suggested she had been climbing hills her whole life and intended to continue. She was carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle in both arms. She reached the entrance of the hollow and stopped, and she looked at Della the way Della had by now learned to recognize the look that saw what was actually there instead of what the situation suggested should be there. She said her name. She held out the bundle. Inside the cloth was a heavy quilt, pieced from at least 4 different fabrics, a blue wool, 2 different cotton prints, and what appeared to be a section of an old coat. It was not new. It had been used and washed and used again. But it was warm, in a way that Della could feel through the cloth before she even opened it all the way, the kind of warmth that has been pressed into the seams by years of use. Della looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the stone shelf and took one of the carved figures, the wren she had made on the longest evening in January, the one she had spent the most time on. The head tilted at an angle she'd worked through 3 attempts to get right, and she held it out. Hattie took it. She looked at it in her palm. Her face did something complicated and then settled. She stayed for perhaps an hour sitting on the flat rock beside the entrance. They talked about the spring, about the planting season, about how early the bloodroot had come up this year, about a particular stretch of the lower creek where the watercress would be coming in soon. They talked about practical things, which is often the most respectful conversation to have with a person whose difficult situation you both acknowledge without needing to name. When Hattie left, she went down the slope without looking back, moving with that same unhurried steadiness. Della went inside and spread the quilt on her sleeping platform and sat on it, and thought about the nature of community, how it does not announce itself, does not require a gathering or an agreement, but simply accretes one small thing at a time like mineral deposits in still water. She was thinking this when the first drop of rain hit the entrance stone. By nightfall it was not rain. The temperature had been dropping since midday, which she had noticed but not weighted heavily enough because the morning had been warm and she had let the warmth lead her judgment. What came in off the ridge that night was not a spring rain, but the last hard storm of a winter that had not finished with the Ozarks, a wet driving sleet that turned to ice where it hit the limestone and built up in ridges along the doorframe and sealed the wind veins solid by midnight. She had her fire, she had the quilt, the hollow held, but she needed firewood and the firewood was outside. She pulled the door open. At first light it took effort, the ice along the frame cracking reluctantly, and stepped out onto a surface that was no longer a surface in any reliable sense. The limestone ledge outside the hollow was sheeted in ice clear and nearly invisible, and she felt her left foot go before she could correct it. Not a slow skid, but a sudden total loss of purchase that happened in less than a second and ended with her on the ground. Her left ankle turned beneath her at an angle that announced itself immediately and definitively. She lay still for a moment. The sleet was hitting her coat and her face. The ankle was reporting information she did not want to receive. She moved her fingers and her other foot and confirmed that nothing else was wrong, and then she assessed the ankle with her hands pressing carefully along the bone. No give. Nothing that felt like fracture, but swollen already and unwilling to take weight when she tested it. She got herself back inside on her hands and one knee, pulling the door closed behind her. She sat against the wall and looked at the fire, which was low, and at the woodpile, which was not low but was outside, and thought about the particular patience required of a situation that will not be forced. Her snares were out. She could not check them. If the storm held 2 days, they would be under ice, and the results would be academic. She stacked what wood she had inside the hollow, fed the fire carefully to extend it, and made herself useful with the things that did not require standing, tightening the lashing on the sleeping platform, reading, carving, writing in the margin of Nathaniel's journal the date and the weather and 3 words still here. Continuing. She slept eventually, and she woke to the sound of the door being pushed open from outside. Jerome stood in the entrance with sleet on the shoulders of his canvas coat, holding 2 pieces of split hickory in one arm and looking at her ankle the way he looked at most things, without alarm, but with full attention. "I saw the smoke stop," he said. "Figured something had gone wrong." He came inside and stacked the hickory by the fire. He looked at the ankle, which she had wrapped in the strip of cloth she'd used earlier for her hand. He went outside again without explanation and returned with a handful of sleet-wet moss, which he packed around the joint with the same efficient care he applied to everything. He stayed 2 days. She had never spent 2 continuous days in close company with anyone who was not family, and she had not known how she would feel about it. What she discovered was that Jerome Pickett was a man who understood the value of not filling silence unnecessarily. He did what needed doing. He ate the food she had. She ate the food he'd brought, and in the evenings he read. He had taken Nathaniel's journal from the shelf with a questioning look, and she had nodded, and he had read it slowly, moving through the pages without hurrying. On the second evening, he set the journal down and looked at the fire for a while. Then, the passage about the brooch, the silver one. She looked at him. "He says it belonged to a woman in Haskell County." Jerome was quiet for a moment. "That's your county." "Yes," she said. "Nathaniel Doss would have been old enough to be your grandfather's contemporary. He would have known the families in the area." She had thought about this in the way that she thought about many things, without quite looking at them directly, letting them occupy the edge of her attention until they were ready to be examined. "The woman he was accused of taking from," Jerome said carefully. "Did he say her name anywhere in the journal?" She knew the journal well enough now to know the answer no. There was no name, only the county, the brooch, the certainty of his innocence, and the decision to leave. Jerome looked at the fire. "The Doss family and the Voss family," he said. "They would have been neighbors once, before the land sales." Della was very still. "I don't know," he said. "I'm not saying I know, but 30 years of winters is a long time for a question to sit under a stone." She looked at the journal on his knee. At the words she had already memorized from the page he had been reading, I did not take it. But I left rather than argue the point, and she thought about the grain of a thing, how it runs through the years, the same as it runs through wood, and how the knife that follows it will always find less resistance than the one that fights it. She thought about who had owned a silver brooch 30 years ago. She thought about her mother's silver brooch engraved with flowers passed down from a woman who had come west from Virginia. Outside, the sleet had turned back to rain, and then the rain had stopped entirely, and now the only sound was the last water running off the limestone ledge and finding its way down the ridge in thin, bright threads. She lay on the sleeping platform under Hattie's quilt and looked at the ceiling of the stone hollow and thought about a question 30 years old, sitting under a flagstone waiting for whoever was patient enough to look. Then she heard a sound below the hollow at the tree line, different from the sounds of settlement and water. A footstep, deliberate. Not Jerome's. Jerome was asleep against the far wall. Not an animal too careful, too patterned. The step came once, then stopped. She waited. The fire gave its small, steady sound. Jerome breathed evenly. The step did not come again. But when the morning arrived and she had made her way on the still tender ankle to the base of the ridge to check the snares she found on the flat rock, where she sometimes left things for Jerome, a cloth bundle. Inside, a small bag of dried corn, a tin of salt, and a folded piece of cloth. She unfolded the cloth. She knew the weave. She knew the color. It was cut from the sleeve of Clem's winter shirt. There was nothing written on it. There didn't need to be. She stood in the cold morning at the base of the ridge and held the piece of cloth and thought about what it meant, that her brother had walked an hour through sleet to stand at the tree line in the dark and leave her salt and corn, and had not been able to make himself climb the rest of the way. She thought about what it would take for him to close that distance. She put the corn and the salt in her bag and the cloth in her coat pocket next to the folded paper her father had given her, and she climbed back up to the hollow. The ankle kept her close to the hollow for another week. This was not entirely unwelcome. She had been moving since February, moving to survive, moving to build, moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking in those early weeks had been a luxury she couldn't consistently afford. The enforced stillness of a swollen joint gave her something she hadn't known she needed: consecutive hours, with nothing required of her hands. She used them to read the journal again from the beginning. She was looking for something specific now, though she could not have named it precisely before she found it. Jerome's observation, the Doss family, and the Voss family neighbors. Once the silver brooch, Haskell County had opened a door in her thinking that she had not gone through yet. She went through it now, slowly, the way she went through the physical door of the hollow, testing her weight before committing. Nathaniel's entries were not dated consistently. He wrote when he felt like writing, which was not every day, and his early entries from the autumn of 1891 were sparser than the winter ones, shorter and more practical. But she found what she had missed on earlier readings, or rather what she had read without the context to understand. October 14th, 1891. I have been in these hills 3 weeks. I do not miss the county. I miss what I believed it was before this year, which is a different thing. A woman I had known since she was a girl accused me of taking a piece of silver jewelry from her mother's dressing table. It was not true. But the truth was not the relevant consideration. What was relevant was that I had once, years ago, failed to pay back a small sum I had borrowed and then forgotten. That was the shape of my reputation. That was what the accusation attached itself to. The jewelry turned up eventually in a drawer where it had slipped behind a divider, but I had already left and no one wrote to tell me. Della read this 3 times, the way she read things that required her to sit still inside the words before she could move around them. The jewelry had turned up in a drawer where it had slipped behind a divider. She looked at the fire for a long time. She was aware in a distant and deliberate way of keeping her breathing even, of not going toward the conclusion faster than the evidence warranted. She was 13 and she had been accused, and she wanted the accusation to be dissolved so completely that there was nothing left of it, and the wanting of that was precisely the reason to be careful. But the evidence was what it was. Nettie Voss was meticulous. Nettie Voss kept her things in specific places and knew precisely what was where, which was how she had known immediately when the brooch was gone. And Nettie Voss had a tall chest with a top drawer, and below it a second drawer, and the divider between those two drawers was a thin strip of wood that had warped slightly over the years and left a gap along the back. Della knew that gap. She had once retrieved a dropped button from behind it. She put the journal down on her knee and looked at the entrance of the hollow where the early April light was coming in warm and specific, falling on the stone floor in a shape that changed hour by hour as the sun moved across the ridge above. She thought about her mother's face, not the face from the morning of the accusation, which she had spent considerable effort not thinking about, but an earlier face. The face of a woman wrapping a small silver oval in flannel on a Sunday morning, her movements careful, her expression for that one moment soft in a way that the rest of the week rarely allowed. There had been love in that somewhere, buried under everything else, under the practicality and the disappointment and the long accumulation of a hard life. But there. The brooch had been her mother's one connection to something gentler, and when it had gone missing, the grief of it had needed somewhere to go. Della was where it had gone. She understood this now in a way she had not been capable of in February. Understanding it did not make it right. But it changed the shape of it from something done to her into something that had happened, which was a smaller and more manageable thing. The ankle allowed her to walk carefully by the following week, and she resumed her full pattern of work, the snares, the firewood, the ongoing maintenance of the hollow's sealed walls, as the temperature swings of early spring alternated between thaw and refreeze and tested the chinking in new places. Hattie came twice in April, once with a small sack of cornmeal and once with nothing except herself, which Della had come to understand was the more significant visit of the two. Jerome came on the first warm Thursday of April and told her he had written to Clara Doss in Eminence. He did not tell her what he had said in the letter, and she did not ask. Some things are best left to the person doing them. Clem came on a Saturday. She heard him from inside the hollow, that same footstep she had first heard through sleet in the dark, but now in daylight, now continuing past the tree line, now on the slope itself. She came to the entrance and watched him climb. He was taller than she remembered, or she had forgotten the scale of him, 17 and broad across the shoulders, already moving up the steep limestone face with the careful, effortful gait of someone who has decided to do a difficult thing and is committed to finishing it. He had his father's look about him when he concentrated, the jaw set, the eyes on the ground ahead. He stopped about 6 feet from the entrance. He looked at the hollow, at the door, the woodpile, the stone shelf with its objects, the wind vane that had been turning freely in the April breeze all morning. He looked at all of it the way Jerome had looked at it the first time, seeing the work, understanding what the work had cost. Then he looked at her. He was carrying something. She saw it now, a small cloth bundle in his left hand, held slightly away from his body in the uncertain manner of someone not sure they have the right to offer what they're carrying. He held it out. She did not take it immediately. She looked at his face, at the effort it was costing him to be here, to be standing on this hillside with this thing in his hand, and she waited because Clem needed to say it with his body before he could say it with words, and she had always known how to wait. He set the bundle on the stone shelf between them carefully and opened the cloth. The brooch was smaller than she remembered. The silver had tarnished slightly, which happened when things were left unwrapped, and the engraved flowers around the edge caught the April light in a way that made them look for a moment like something alive. Clem's voice, when it came, was low and had cost him something. It was behind the divider in the second drawer. Papa found it last week when he fixed the warping. He pulled the divider out and it was right there. He stopped, started again. I knew it might be somewhere like that. I thought it might. I didn't. He stopped again. His jaw worked. I was afraid of her. That's the truth of it. I was afraid of what she'd do if I said I thought she was wrong. The April air between them was warm and smelled of cedar and new mud and the particular green smell of things beginning again after a long cold. Della looked at the brooch on the stone shelf. She thought about Nathaniel Doss writing by firelight, about the ease with which one person's certainty becomes another person's verdict. She thought about the gap behind the drawer divider and a small oval piece of silver and 32 years of a different story that had reached the same ending. She thought about the grain of a thing and how it runs the same way, whether or not anyone is watching. She picked up the brooch. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular solidity of old silver, the edges of the engraved flowers under her thumb, and then she held it out to Clem. His face changed. Her voice was quiet and certain. Take it back to her. It was always hers. He looked at the brooch in her outstretched hand. He looked at her face. Something in him, she could see it happening, the slow release of something he had been carrying since February came undone. He took the brooch. He folded the cloth around it with careful hands. He sat down on the flat rock beside the entrance, and she sat beside him, and they looked out at the Ozark hills, green now with the insistence of spring, ridge after ridge going south and west into a distance that seemed in the April light less like distance than like depth. They did not talk about their mother. They talked about the farm, about a calf that had been born unexpectedly in March, about a fence section that had come down in the same storm that had iced the ridge. They talked about their father, who was well, who did not know Clem was here. They talked about the creek at the base of the ridge which Clem had crossed with more difficulty than he expected. After a while, Clem looked at the hollow behind her. "You built this yourself?" It was not a question. "Most of it," she said. "Jerome helped with some." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the door, the stone shelf, the chinking along the wall where she had sealed it against the wind. "Papa would want to see it," he said finally. "If you—" He stopped himself, started more carefully. "If you ever wanted him to." She didn't answer that. Not yet. There were things that needed to happen in their own sequence, and she had learned the patience to let them. Jerome came on a Wednesday 2 weeks later with a letter in his coat pocket. He handed it to her without preamble and stood back while she read it. The handwriting was old spidery and slanting, the letters formed in a style she associated with people who had learned to write when writing was still considered a significant skill worth taking time with. Clara Doss was 81 years old and lived in a room at her niece's house in Eminence, and she wrote the way old people write when they have decided that the time remaining does not justify indirection. "Dear Mr. Pickett, my uncle Nathaniel Doss is spoken of rarely in this family, mostly because my father found him an inconvenient subject. Nathaniel was the better man of the two, but Everett was the one who stayed, and staying counts for something in these hills. The ridgeland you describe has been in the family name since before I was born. I have never visited it, and have no intention of doing so at my age. I understand from your letter that a girl has been living in the hollow there since February. My uncle lived in that same hollow for 2 winters, which I learned from his journal, which Everett kept but never read, and which I have had in my possession since Everett died. I am enclosing a document which my niece's husband, who is a notary, has witnessed and stamped. It transfers my interest in the ridge parcel to the current occupant. The legal description is approximate but sufficient for the county record. I will say only this. My uncle went to that hollow because the world had been unjust to him, and he left it because he believed he had recovered enough to try the world again. I hope the same proves true for your girl. The land is hers for as long as she needs it, and afterward as she sees fit. I would appreciate it if someone could tell me whether the journal is still there. It would comfort me to know it is being read. Clara Doss." Della read the letter twice. She folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the ridge above the hollow, the limestone face, the cedar along the top, the long, slanting light of a May morning falling across it all. Jerome was watching her. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression of a man who has delivered good news before and knows that it requires a different quality of silence than ordinary silence. She thought about Nathaniel Doss packing his tin box and sealing it under the flagstone in the spring of 1893, writing the last entry in his journal before he walked out of this hollow and back into the world. She thought about the particular faith required to leave something behind for a person you would never meet to believe, despite every evidence to the contrary, that experience provides that the world contains people worth leaving things for. The land was hers. Not because she had inherited it, not because she had bought it, not because someone who loved her had provided it. Because a man who had needed exactly what she had needed 30 years before she was born had recognized something in this stone hollow that was larger than his own particular grief, and his niece, reading his words at 81, had understood. She went inside and took the journal from the shelf. She carried it out and held it in the May sunlight, the worn leather cover, the cracked spine, the pages she had read until she knew them, the way she knew the limestone walls, and the pattern of the wind on the ridge. She would write to Clara Doss herself. She would tell her the journal was there and that it had been read and that it would be kept. Jerome left midday, and the afternoon came in warm and full of bird noise. The season had reached the point where the birds were loud and various, and everywhere filling the hollow and the ridge with a sound that was almost like argument, but was really just the loudness of spring insisting on itself. She sat outside on the flat rock at the entrance and took out Nathaniel's knife, the one with 4 words on the handle, and she took out a small piece of cedar she had been working on for several days. It was going to be a bird. She had not decided yet what kind of bird. She worked with the grain. She had learned through the winter and its failures that the piece told you what it was going to be if you paid enough attention, and that forcing it into a predetermined shape produced something that was technically correct, but somehow false, the wood resisting in a way that showed in the final form. The best work came from listening. The cedar came away in thin, fragrant curls. The shape emerged slowly, a small, round body, a head that wanted to tilt slightly, wings that were not spread but not folded, either caught at the precise moment between one thing and the next. She was still working when she heard the footstep below. Not Clem's step this time. Not Jerome's measured circuit. A heavier step, less practiced on this terrain, the step of a man who had spent his life on cleared land and was negotiating rock and root with attention. She set the carving down. Her father came up the slope the way he did most things, steadily, without show, his big hands out slightly from his sides for balance on the uneven ground. He was wearing his good coat, which she did not understand until she did. He had dressed as though this were a visit worth dressing for. He stopped at the base of the hollow and looked at what she had made. He looked at it for a long time. The door, the stone shelf, the wind vane, the wood pile, the chinking along the walls, precise and thorough, the work of someone who understood that the difference between a shelter and a home is the willingness to attend to the small things. When he looked at her, his face was doing what it had done in the farmhouse doorway in February, the complicated working of a man whose interior life exceeds his ability to put it into words. But he had come. He had dressed in his good coat and crossed the creek and climbed the ridge, and that was a language she could read. His voice was low. "Clem told me." She waited. "About the drawer, about the brooch." He stopped. "I should have—" He stopped again. Started a third time, and this time he went all the way through. "I should have told her she was wrong. I knew she might be wrong. I didn't say so. That's on me." The May afternoon was warm enough that she had pushed her coat back off her shoulders. The bird noise continued above them, indifferent and abundant, the way the natural world continues its business during human reckonings. She looked at her father's face, at the lines of it, the weathering, the evidence of the 30 years he had spent in the Ozark wind, doing the work of keeping a family alive. And she felt something move through her that was not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implies a debt being canceled. And she was not sure she was in the business of canceling debts, but was something adjacent to it. A release of the grip on something she had been holding since February that was heavy and had cost her more than she had acknowledged. She picked up the carving from the rock beside her. The small cedar bird, not quite finished, the wood still fragrant from the afternoon's work, and she held it out. He took it. He looked at it in his palm, the way people look at small, carefully made things, with a slight slowing, a change in the quality of their attention. His thumb moved across the grain of the wood, across the tilted head, along the edge of the half-raised wing. "The grain runs true," she said quietly. He looked up at her. She nodded at the knife on the rock beside her, the handle with its 4 carved words worn smooth by Nathaniel Doss, and now by her. Harlan Voss looked at the knife, and then at the bird in his hand, and then at the hollow behind her, the sealed walls, the sturdy door. The evidence of a winter survived, and more than survived, and something in his face that had been working against itself since February finally came to rest. He did not stay long. He was not a man who found long stays easy, and she did not need him to stay long. What she needed, she had already received: the climb, the coat, the words he had gotten all the way through. Before he left, he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small paper-wrapped package. He set it on the stone shelf without explaining it, and she understood this was how the Voss family expressed what it could not say directly. After he had gone back down the slope and the sound of his footstep had faded below the tree line, she opened it. Inside was a small block of birchwood, clean-grained and dry, selected with care. The kind of wood that a person who had watched someone carve things for years would know to choose. She held it in both hands. She could already feel the shape inside it, not a bird this time. Something else. She would find out what it was when she let the wood tell her. The evening came in the way Ozark evenings come in May, slowly, with color, the light going from gold to amber to the particular deep blue that precedes dark. The ridge above her turned the light warm for a long time before it let it go. The cedar smell was strong in the cooling air. Below the hollow, the creek made its sound, which she had by now memorized the way she had memorized Nathaniel's handwriting, and the specific weight of the larger knife, and the sound Jerome's footstep made on frozen ground as a thing that was hers, now part of the inventory of what she knew. She went inside and lit a small fire, more for the light than the warmth, and she sat beside it with the new block of birch in one hand and the knife in the other. On the back wall of the hollow where the limestone was flattest, and the firelight reached it in the evenings, she had scratched a date into the stone 2 weeks after her arrival, February 1922. She had put it there for the same reason Nathaniel had put his words in the journal, not as monument, but as evidence. Someone was here. It mattered. She looked at it now. Then she got up carefully and went to the wall, and below her date she scratched 4 more words into the limestone, small and deliberate, following the groove of the grain in the rock, the way she followed the grain in wood. The grain runs true. She stepped back and looked at what was there now. Nathaniel's presence implied by the hollow itself, and her presence marked in stone, and between them the 4 words that had traveled from his knife handle to her hand through Silas Pym. And whatever chain of understanding had preceded him, the phrase finding its way forward through time, the same way water finds its way down a hillside, not by force but by following what is already there. She sat back down by the fire. She picked up the birch block. She began. The Ozark hills had gone dark beyond the entrance, and the stars were coming out above the ridge with the unhurried certainty of things that have been doing this for a very long time. The creek was audible in the quiet. A whip-poor-will started up somewhere in the lower timber, its call the sound of a summer night arriving to stay. The fire gave it small, steady light, and the knife moved with the grain, and the cedar and birch smell of the hollow mixed with the cool night air drifting in through the gap at the top of the door. Outside, the world was what it was, imperfect and sometimes unjust and full of people who meant well but lost their nerve at critical moments. 30 years from now, someone might need this hollow the way she had needed it. Someone might stand in the entrance and see not ruin, but possibility, might press their hand to the floor and find it dry, might find the scratch marks on the wall and understand they were not the first. She would leave something for them. Not the coins, those were nearly gone. Not the journal, which would go to Clara Doss. But the knife, perhaps, when she no longer needed it. And whatever she carved from the birch block in her hands. And the 4 words in the wall in her handwriting beside Nathaniel's implied presence running true. She worked until the fire burned low, and then she went to sleep under Hattie's quilt on the platform she had built with her own hands in the stone hollow that was hers by a chain of kindness that stretched back further than she could trace. She had walked into these hills in February with a canvas bag and a small knife, and a silence she had been growing for years. She was still here. That was not a small thing. If there is a story in your life of a door that closed and led you somewhere you were meant to be, a loss that became a beginning, a casting out that turned into a homecoming, we would love to hear it in the comments below. The stories you carry are worth telling.